Thank you, everybody, for being here, both in person and online. Thank you for the good turnout. I do appreciate it. We're doing a hybrid meeting, so we're all still kind of figuring all this out together. So thank you so much for your patience with us. In person, there's not a lot of people here, so we'll have great discussions with each other. You do not have to raise your hand because I can see that you will want to talk. For our virtual attendance, just a couple housekeeping items before, so people kind of are familiar with the functions. So right here, you have an image of a mock-up of your Teams meeting. So if you, okay, it's supposed to. We love you to stay muted until we get to a point where we have discussion, and then you are welcome to come off of mute and let us know what you're thinking if you have questions. What's really helpful is that raise hand button that can help us know that you want to say something. You know, we raise our hands in person and we now have a virtual way of doing so. And so I'd love for folks to use that if you can, but we have a small enough group today that if you just wanted to hop off of mute and say something, that would be fine. And then, as always, the chat is available for questions as they come into your mind, and we can address them when we get to an appropriate place, or if you have commentary or just want to engage with others on the presentation, the chat is always open and you're welcome to use it. We're going to do a couple polls as part of this webinar. And so those polls are going to show up in the chat box. They don't, unfortunately, pop up on your screen like some of the other programs do. Those will appear as an item in the chat box. And so we'll leave those open for people so that you have a chance to kind of click on those questions and submit what your response is. But generally, they're not going to pop up like they do on the Teams. So keep an eye out for that as we're going along. Good morning. Today, we're going to talk about a couple things. So we have a really exciting program suite for April. We have our climate adaptation plan today. I will be talking about that quickly. But then we're excited to welcome Amanda Lowe from our Range Agriculture and Forestry program, who's going to talk about the Women's First Foods Monitoring Project that we have going, have at least 1 year of data collected and some of the kinks and stuff worked out. And we're going to have a 5-minute break in between that. And so that is for both in person and online. So let's get started with the poll. So I'm going to open this poll up online. Like I said, it's going to appear in the chat for you. And I would love to know, what role do you play in your community or household around food? And so we have a few options. We have gatherers. This is subsistence and culture. We have hunters, food preparation, that's like chopping, like a line chef. Supervisor, if you're the person who's like, okay, this needs to go into the dish at this time, this one can wait. The cook literally is the person doing the prep. You know, fishermen are out there on the rivers, fish people. First food scout, if you're going out and seeing if the foods are ready. Grocer gopher, this is just my little colloquial term. If you are the person that goes to the grocery store and picks up all the food and hefts it back, that's the role. Gardener is the person tending those non-first foods and actively cultivating those. And there's always the option of none. If you just eat all of the rocks and weeds around your house, that's cool too, although I feel like that technically counts as gardening. And then if there's others, go ahead and put that in the chat. So here in the room, we're going to do a show of hands. They're a gatherer. 1, excellent. How about a hunter? Oh, 2, excellent. Food prep. I do food prep in my house. Lots of prep. Supervisors. Who are the ones who keep us in line? I do that for myself. How about chefs? Cooks in the room. I do my own cooking. Lots of good cooks in the room. How about fishers? Who are our fishers? We got Wes or Jess.
Hand up.
There you go. First food scout. I mean, you do it all. It's a one-stop shop. First food scout. Anybody go out and check on the foods and readiness? Perfect. How about grocer gopher? I go and get my own groceries. Excellent. Anyone a gardener? Does anyone tend gardens? Excellent. See, there you go. That's a great selection. I love it. I'm going to leave the poll up for a little while for people online to be able to submit their answers. And so we're just gonna keep trucking along. We have a lot to cover today. Thank you for participating with that. That was great. So we're going to switch gears and come on over to our climate adaptation plan. So let me do some Hollywood magic here. All right. Nope. There we go. Hey, we're figuring it out. Yeah. I just seen the first one. It was a little bit rocky. So, as you know, our climate adaptation plan has been published. It is 300 pages long, so I don't expect anybody to really like sit down and read it, although we did have one person do that. So big thanks to Trevor Williams, who sat down and read it cover to cover. That's why we're doing this, is we're going through all of the sections so that people have kind of a sense of just what's in it and where to go for information. And so today we're going to be covering the first foods availability and access component, which runs from pages 67 to 104. And so I printed out for you guys in person. Thanks for being here. And so we're just going to run through it, hopefully in under 20 minutes. So the first part of this is, I'm going to not block your view here. This conference room is rather awkwardly set up, but we're doing what we can. So we have the first couple pages are just like that overview. And if you have seen the executive summary of the plan, the executive summary is basically just all of these cover pages and then a summary page at the back of each section. But this is the detail in the plan. And so for this first component, we are on page 70. And so the first impact that we have specifically to first foods is that warming surface water temperature. And the chart that we have is from a Forest Service study that was done in 2018 by Katie Clifton. And it shows on the left, you have historic stream temperatures. And then on the right, you have a modeled almost end of century projection under one of the climate scenarios. And so there's a bunch of different climate scenarios. I'm not going to go into kind of the specifics of this. But on the maps, you can see that extremely cold water, which is 8 degrees Celsius, are in the dark blue lines. And then hot water is classified as 20 degrees Celsius, and it's shown up in the purple. There's that range in between. And so we can see that between these two pictures, extremely hot water increases by 98% from our historic condition to mid-century and 218% by end of century. And so the, oh, I think I have the mouse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yep, I'll just give this to you.
Colleen, I'm admitting people as well.
All right.
Thank you. I might need you to do the scrolling then. And so we can see that the most impacted streams are going to be the low elevation tributaries. So that's going to impact things like the Wanakit Wildlife Area, the mouth of the Umatilla River at the Columbia Confluence, and some of those northern slopes on the Wenatchee-Tucannon Wilderness. Working out okay? Okay. The least impacted areas are going to be those high elevation areas. So the places where it still gets cold enough to maintain, that's good right there. Yep, that's perfect. Cold enough to maintain that cold water. And so least impacted, we expect to see the Eagle Cap Wilderness, the Grand Ronde River areas, and then parts of the Elkhorn Mountain. And so you can see that those are, our high elevation pockets right here. So it's not great news for a lot of the area. And so when we look at maps like this, we can see that maybe down here in these areas, we are going to be fighting against time and some pretty large forces to retain cold water in those areas. So I try not to think of it as losing cold water species habitat so much as gaining some of those more heat tolerant species habitat. And so in areas where we expect to see, heat rising, maybe we could prioritize lamprey restoration instead of the salmon restoration. But salmon and bull trout can still really be maintained up in those higher elevations. So it's about making these decisions. Where do we want to dig our feet in? And where do we want to change a little bit with the times, understanding that we do still have species that could benefit from those situations. I would love for you to scroll down a little bit, Jess.
Yeah.
Maybe fall off of the page.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you in the chat. That's great feedback.
I could see the maps right now.
You can see it. Thank you, Lindsay. Perfect.
Oh.
So this is the second map I want people to see. And please do shout out if it's not showing what you think it's supposed to. We're really learning. We're lucky to have Jess here helping us out with this, but we're all still trying to figure it out. So please let us know if you think it's not showing what it needs to be showing. Our second impact is going to be plant habitat suitability migration. And that's going to be kind of a general thing for everybody, especially our upland species. They really require on the plants habitat around them. And so that migration of plants is also going to affect migration of those animal species as well. This map that you're seeing is from a Forest Service study. They did a phenology timing study to look at how those changes will be manifesting over time. And so we have this range, this color range where purple is, a gain in habitat, while red is a loss in habitat, and there's that range in between. On the left is the low emission scenario, and on the right is a high emission scenario. And so we can see really from this rough data, and that's really what I'm estimating this from, is just like looking at the map, being like, well, it's a rough estimate of this, that there's going to be severe degradation of habitat, 20 to 30% degradation at lower altitudes. Most impacted are going to be the Wanaha, Tucannon, North Fork, Umatilla Wilderness, and Northern Elkhorn Mountains. The good news is there's going to be very modest gain in habitat for huckleberries. This is for huckleberries in the Eagle Cap Mountain Wilderness. And so for huckleberries specifically, we're having to use the huckleberry species as a proxy estimate for some of our other plant first foods, because unfortunately huckleberries are the ones that get a lot of the focus right now. And so we're using this one estimate to say this is what we think might happen to the other species. And so we can see that northern migration, northward and upslope migration of these habitat areas. And so that means we'll probably be losing suitable habitat at lower altitudes, but gaining habitat at higher altitudes. And this affects people who are hoping to do gathering, because those areas where we do traditional gathering, if they're a lower elevation, they might not produce berries in the way that they used to. And so we might have to look at cultivating populations and connections at higher altitudes.
Oh, no.
Yep, you're good. Okay. And so we also have a temporal shift. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down a little bit, Jess. The same study projected a time shift. And so time shift in terms of when the berries are ready.
Yeah, I mean, visible screen.
All kinds of fun. There we go. Temporal shifts. This study estimated a time shift of 1 to 2 months earlier. Plants would be ready earlier than historically projected. And I think that that's something that we hear the gatherers talk about as things being ready at different times, especially, you know, I've heard that celery feast is kind of moving up in the calendar time. But it's important to know there's a lot of variation in those estimates. And so while it might be earlier one year, it might be on time or later another year. So that's the beauty of statistics. Wouldn't mind scrolling down, please. Perfect. Keep going a little bit. Yep, number 3. So our third impact is to pollinators and other insects. And I'm super excited for our second component of this event later this month, when we'll have Cheryl Shippentauer and her pollinator team share with us some of their studies and the amazing work that has been done for first foods specifically. Again, first foods don't really get a lot of attention in research. And so we're having to fill in some of those gaps where tribes are stepping in to be the leaders in this knowledge. And so for pollinators, we have here figure 3B.3 on page 73 is the average change in habitat suitability for 15 bumblebee species. And we picked bumblebee species specifically just because that is the information that's out there. Bumblebees are a charismatic megafauna, and so they're very cute. And so a lot of people like to keep their eye on them. I am included in that. And so we see from these 15 bumblebee species, they're ranked from most vulnerable to least vulnerable. And so we have a big list of the bumblebees, and I'm not going to go through them, but I did want to highlight a couple selections in here because they have been flagged by our pollinator team as pollinating first foods. And so those two that I really wanted to note was a black-notched bumblebee, Bombus bifarius, and then the fuzzy horn bumblebee, Bombus mixtus. So we see from this estimate, the study, that Bombus bifarius will experience a habitat decrease of 30% across the Pacific Northwest. And Bombus mixtus is expected to experience a 6% decline in habitat suitability across the Pacific Northwest. I'm scrolling. Thank you very much. So as mentioned, CTUIR is conducting its own inventory of important pollinators for first foods. And so I'm really excited to have Cheryl and her team talk on April 26th, 2 weeks from now, very specifically about those efforts. And so this photo is from Beecology. Sarah Gardner has been doing a lot of the pollinator work with Cheryl and took this amazing photo. And so we have these estimates from studies that Beecology did looking at the different pollinators of first foods. And so I'm not going to necessarily go through a lot of these, but we know that minor bees, and a couple of other different kinds of native bees are the ones that are doing the pollinating for these first foods. It is my understanding that no honeybees visited the first foods. And so it's really important to note that, because when we talk about bee preservation and bee habitat, we're not talking about honeybees. Like, honeybees get a lot of attention, but honeybees are actually a non-native species to our area. And there is some preliminary evidence that they can displace native bees from the land, especially with those pollen resources. And so when we talk about bee restoration and bee habitat, we are talking about native bees, not honeybees. And so things to keep an eye on are land management practices and agricultural activity really impact pollinators. And then there's pathogens that are out there that affect honeybees that can be transmitted to native bees. And there are a lot of citizen science initiatives that we can participate with, like the Oregon Bee Project and the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. Wouldn't mind scrolling. What time is it?
9:25.
Thank you. So the next impact that we have, I have to go faster. I know this is a lot. What we have here, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down just a tiny bit so we can see the graph, perfect. This chart came from global estimates of invasive species movement, range and expansion and contraction. Now, I understand that this is a global estimate, and so that means that it's not super local to our area, but it does provide a proxy estimation for us to start from in terms of what we might be looking at that will be most impactful. And from this study, we see that the largest range expansions occur for aquatic invertebrates at almost 60% expansion, terrestrial plants at 12% expansion, and terrestrial insects at 18% expansion. There was relatively little effect on mammals, reptiles, fungi, and microorganisms, and we actually lose range for amphibians and bird species. A Pacific Northwest specific study flagged feral pigs and feral cats, and Lindsay, I think you also mentioned those as well in our conversation, as specifically increasing for our area, which is not great news for our birds. And then the feral pigs are something that I think more and more people have been recognizing as a pest in our area. So maybe we can get some luau's going. I'm just saying, you guys. So we have lists of aquatic species, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, Jess. Please, thank you. A list of plant species and a list of insect species that are high priority. But then our range agriculture and forestry program also has some pretty extensive management plans that really go through invasive species management. And so I refer always to those plans, those existing plans, and that great work that's being done. Wouldn't mind going down. Perfect. So riparian and topsoil erosion, because heavy precipitation moves particles if they're not anchored down, because we expect to see an increase in heavy precipitation events, we expect to see an increase in erosion. There's a pretty normal connection between those two things. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down so we can see the chart. Thank you very much. This was a very preliminary research effort that actually came out of collaboration with the Agricultural Research Service and the Columbia Area Agricultural Research, the REACH. Yeah, you know. Thank you, Stuart. And so this is a projection of the changing weather conditions on soil erosion. So on the left, we have our historic conditions. No, on the left, we have conventional tillage. So that's those big mortarboards that kick up all the dust and everything. And on the right, we have no-till. So that's the direct seeding where they're not tilling the ground, but they're putting the seeds directly in and they grow from there. And that leaves a lot more vegetation on the surface. I can see that there are people wanting in the lobby. Oh, you're good. Thank you so much. And so we see that conventional tillage, the green bars here, light green, is going to be our control. So those are historic conditions. And then the dark green is going to be a climate projection. And so that's a increase, which translates to a 2.2 Celsius degree increase. So, you know, we're on track for a pretty solid 1.5 degree Celsius increase. So 2.2 is a little bit higher than, you know, kind of our run-of-the-mill estimate, but it's a good thing to know what like the worst case scenario could be. And so we see that by far conventional tillage creates a lot more erosion than the no-till. But we do see the no-till does actually increase regardless of those practices. And so no-till is an amazing thing to be doing at a vast scale in our area, but it does not solve our erosion problem, unfortunately. And we do see the biggest increases of erosion in those winter months when we have those heavy precipitation. Would you mind scrolling down? You got it. Hey, nicely done. Coming on up in the world. You're doing great. So knowing that even if we converted all of the agricultural land around us into no-till, which is a great idea, we will still see an increase in erosion. So what should we do about that? How do we adapt to that? And I propose that our heat-tolerant freshwater mussel species, the Anodonta species specifically, does an amazing job of filtering water. Like that's all it does all day. And estimates are that a single freshwater mussel can filter over 175,000 gallons of water in a year. And so that's one mussel. So imagine if we were out planting all of these heat-tolerant mussels into our sediment-affected streams, what kind of restoration we could be doing there. And so I was really happy to highlight the partnership that the tribe has with the Walla Walla Community College Water and Environmental Center. So they're doing some amazing things, raising Pacific lamprey and freshwater mussels up at that lab. If you could scroll down, please. Thank you. So big game. So this one is connected also with the forage. And so our impact 6, disconnect between vegetation growth and big game nutritional needs. This study came from Michael Wisdom and was conducted out at the Starkey Experimental National Forest in the Blue Mountains. And so it's pretty local conditions. It's very rough estimates. So he doesn't put numbers to anything out here. He just kind of has our big parameters, things like soil moisture, rain, snowpack, plant growth, female fat, calf births. All of those are put in those different color arcs. And I have put those hashed lines for comparison because the graph could be a little bit more clear in kind of the way that it conveys the information. I contacted Michael. I said, Michael, could you give me your data so I could make a better graph? And he declined that offer. And so we'll do with what we can. But we see that peak biomass will no longer coincide with the timing of elk calf births. And so the way that elk populations might respond to this is modifying their migration patterns to stay longer in places with better forage. And I know that driving around out here, we've all seen that the great forage are the farmlands. And so they're probably going to hang out longer on the farmlands. Don't have access to harvest them as readily. And there also might be a timing issue as a result of that nutritional deficit, where female elk will calve every other year or periodically. And so we already know that people are struggling to get their elk for the year, deer for the year. And so to the idea that elk would stagger their calving so that it would be even less on the landscape is a little bit concerning. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down to this. So changes in plant and animal pathogen potential. I lumped plants and animals together in pathogens because we know that a lot of pathogens are fungi, bacteria, and these things really love warm and wet, which is what we're expecting climate conditions to bring us more of. And so there's little information available on how pests and disease associated with first food specifically will change. Elk and deer, elk, deer, and bighorn sheep are kind of the one exception to that, where there is a little bit more knowledge. And so here in our figure 3B.7 on page 80, we have a proxy estimate for Douglas fir trees. So this is just one single disease for one single species. There's so much more information that we need to make good decisions for the future. But we see in this chart that we have the black line is 1-year-old Douglas fir needles, and the white line is 2-year-old Douglas fir needles in response to increasingly warm winter temperatures and the amount of disease that generates in those two age categories. So we see that a 5 degrees Celsius increase results in a 15% increase in infection of 1-year-old needles and a 30% increase in 2-year-old needles. And so we know from climate projections that have been done for our area that our winter temperatures will increase 2.4 to 3 degrees Celsius, which puts us into that 9 degrees Celsius wintertime range by 2050, by mid-century. And so this corresponds with that 15 to 30% increase. So we expect to see disease potential for trees to go up. And we also expect this for other species as well. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down. Our forestry professionals have flagged a couple things for us to keep in mind. Western pine beetle, mountain pine beetle, and pine engraver are species that they struggle with currently and will probably increase with climate conditions. If you wouldn't mind scrolling a little bit further, perfect. As well as the western spruce budworm. And then big game species. So I'm really excited. We're going to do a dedicated look at wildlife pathology in July. So we have Andrew Wildbill is the wildlife program manager for our wildlife program. And we're going to do a driving tour of the Hell's Canyon Initiative, where they're experiencing spillover from domestic sheep and goat populations into the bighorn sheep. And so we're going to have actually a dedicated look at the MOV, as well as talk a little bit about chronic wasting disease, which is something that has not occurred yet in our state. Well, boy, howdy, it should not get a hold here because it's very difficult to eradicate. We also flagged the EHD, the epizootic hemorrhagic disease, as well as Lindsay had mentioned, COVID-19 actually had been detected in deer on the East Coast. And so it hasn't been detected out here, but it does highlight that spillover potential, that as we see more human and wildlife interaction, that encroachment into the wildland-urban interface, that their diseases might be a concern for us and our diseases might be a concern for them. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. I wouldn't mind scrolling down. Okay, thank you. I have a list of diseases. The ick disease is something that our hatchery folks specifically have flagged. And the hatchery operations are going to be the most impacted by these diseases because much like farm animals, they're in close concentration together. Those fish being reared in those conditions are also more likely to contribute or pass disease between them, especially as conditions warm. And so our hatchery professionals had flagged the fact that ick contributed to an 8.5% increase in loss of hatchery stock during the heat dome effect as compared to previous years. So that's a thing to keep an eye on for everyone. If you wouldn't mind scrolling. So now we're into what do we do about all of this? The first half is all the doom and gloom. The second half is how do we get around this? And so for the first adaptation goal, we have anticipate habitat shift and migration. And so a lot of this is climate projection modeling. So there are some really great partners that we could work with in the area that are interested in looking at how species are migrating. And so making sure that we're tagging on with those folks, making sure that we're having dedicated protocols and planning to look at habitat shift. I know that our cultural resources program has been doing some GPS tagging of culturally significant plants right now. And so that's great information to start collecting to see if it's shifting and how the magnitude of that shift. There's also a lot of those citizen science opportunities. So again, specifically, I had highlighted the Oregon Bee Project and the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, but there are also more generic citizen monitoring networks. So like the Local Environmental Observer Network is based out of Alaska, but has a map that includes all of the contiguous United States. And then over the long term, we want to make sure that we're cultivating legally defensible data. So I just had a person from planning in here. Andrea Hall was in here chatting with me, and she was talking about enforcement. And enforcement is something that keeps coming up in these conversations. We can make all the plans that we want, but if we can't enforce them, then what is really the impact that's being done? And so that's where that legally defensible data is really important, is if we do need to defend our actions to legislature, to lawyers, we need to make sure that we're collecting the best data, and that means having a protocol in place and doing it as legally defensible as possible. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down, please. And so partnerships, with the idea that our first food migration range will change, we need to be looking at where are they going to go and who do we need to be talking to continue to keep those relationships alive. And so looking at not only those habitat migration patterns, but also where are they going for getting in touch with the people, the land that they're going to be going to. And so building new partnerships, continuing old ones is going to be a huge part of this. Thank you, partners, for being here. You wouldn't mind scrolling down. So invasive species management obviously is something that we're gonna have to, we're doing already, but making sure that we're moving with the future is something to keep an eye on. And I've included displaced species in here too, because in conversations with tribal members, the pelicans, the sea lions, those keep coming up in conversation because they are out here. They're not necessarily non-native because they're kind of just slightly outside of their range, but they are impacting our restoration efforts. And so, especially the fishery folk want to talk about, like, what are we going to do about these displaced species? So that's the phrasing around displaced. They're native species slightly outside of their range, causing some issues. And so this is a lot of, again, continuing to do what we're already doing, coordinate with other agencies who are doing this work, public engagement, making sure that people aren't tracking seeds and things on their shoes, their tires, intentionally planting. If I see one more gardener put myrtle spurge into their garden, I'm going to lose my mind. And so just making sure that people are aware of those particularly harmful plants, and then continuing to implement those monitoring initiatives. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down. And so that goes the same with the terrestrial invasives. There's a lot of overlap between these two. But one thing that I did really want to flag, because I'm personally very interested in this idea, is the invasivore movement. And so this is where people are going out and harvesting the invasive plants with the intention of utilizing them in some way. So I've seen a lot of people making like cordage out of invasive species. There are a couple Instagrammers, I'm sorry to include Instagram in our climate adaptation plan, but this is the future. There are some people who are doing some really actually amazing work, eating invasive plants, working with invasive plants, making them useful so that we're out there harvesting them on the land. And I think that this is also really important for our partner organizations, because it's my probably controversial opinion that people who are non-tribal should not be harvesting tribal plants. And so with that idea of wanting to be out on the land, wanting to do good as a non-tribal person, what you can be doing is harvesting the invasive species, right? Like, we brought them, we need to deal with them. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down. The other thing that really came up was wildfire risk. And so this is a lot of that vegetation management. So that's a really broad conversation. And I know that our in our BIA fire operations office is very enthusiastic about prescribed burns, and I think that's amazing. It's just there's a number of institutional barriers that tend to exist. And so addressing some of those, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down. Yeah, we're going to move a little bit more quickly through this. And so this is an opportunity to look at how do we support those intentional burns. I love this photo, aerial ignition. It does look a little bit like they're going to war with the land, but I understand that there's a lot that needs to be burned. So we make do and we move into the future. And so highlighting again the TREX program, I know that there are a number of TREX trainings for prescribed fire professionals that have been held in conjunction with tribal nations. And so that might be something to think about in the future, putting together with ourselves and whoever does the hosting in TREX. So you wouldn't mind going down a little bit. Just a quick plug for preparedness of homes and families for fire. You know, our BIA fire operations team does a great job of every year hosting a community outreach to try and get people to institute fire breaks, clean the vegetation out of their gutters, anything that's flammable. We're already doing that, and so just continuing to support that is great. Perfect. Yeah, species migration. Species migration is one that needs to have community engagement. So we can't just be putting things out there because we feel like it. I know that there are a number of opinions within the tribal community about facilitated migration of species. And so I think the very first step is to just have a conversation with the community about what those sentiments are. Like, how much opposition is there? Are there specific species that people are opposed to moving? Just getting a sense of where people's attitudes are on facilitated migration. Because there are already some people who are doing it. So Naknu Withlamati Chamna, caretakers of the land, up in Cove, Oregon, have been doing a lot of the facilitated migration already. And so they're wonderful resources to look to for how do we do this work in practice once we get a handle on what everybody's opinions are. So that's going to be a lot of that. And so we'll move down to E, the research and regulatory understanding of first foods harvest. This was something that really came out of conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Commission, because you know, the initial draft of this had a really heavy emphasis on the language of treaty rights. And there were a number of Fish and Wildlife commissioners who said, treaty rights are wonderful, they're very important. Contingent of people who might not understand how to sustainably harvest first foods, especially some of our roots and berry species. And so, you know, we hear stories about people going out with the rakes to the huckleberries and just like raking the plants. It's very harmful to the plants. And I've heard tribal members say that they're going to go out and do that, name names, but so just making sure that we're all on the same page about what is the best practices for harvesting of first foods. And that can involve also a research component to it as well. You wouldn't mind scrolling down. Perfect. And so this is a photo of actually one of the plantings that caretakers of the land out in Cove did back in 2021. I was very fortunate to get to go out there and be part of that. They were planting the wapato. So they had come up with some water potato species out of the Richland area, and they were replanting them. I know it's an altitude shift, but hopefully they'll do okay. And so they're replanting them and restoring what was wheatland, conventional tilled wheatland, as part of the Ascension School in Cove, Oregon. They're trying to restore that to the natural wetland species out there. And so that is already a group of people who's doing facilitated migration, but then also working with our other partner organizations like CritFic, like the Intertribal Bison Management Group, to look at where are migration opportunities, how can we support that, and what is the appropriate. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, we're going to skip that page. I'm going to breeze real quick because I am out of time. Flooding affects harvest access. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down to the next page. And so this impact 8 just highlights the fact that this is again another Forest Service study that was done as part of that Katie Clifton research that looks at roads in the national forest that are along stream beds. And so it gives kind of this vulnerability range for those roads. The ones that are right next to the stream and inundated regularly get the highest level of vulnerability, whereas if the ones that are a little bit higher that are not inundated quite so much get a lower index of vulnerability. And so we can see that there's quite a few roads. The red is the vulnerable, I think, yeah. And so we can see that there's quite a few roads in our national forest that tribal members are probably using to access first foods harvest opportunities that are going to be impacted by flooding. Wouldn't mind scrolling. Everybody knows that we've had a lot of fire recently. It's going to keep going. And so the fire is a natural part of the landscape, but it is a problem because it threatens public safety and then it threatens access. And so as we see temperatures increase, the opportunity for catastrophic wildfire also increases. But a part of our adaptation strategies are to increase those prescribed burn opportunities where appropriate to try and get around this risk. You wouldn't mind scrolling down. The chart, please. Thank you. So this chart, just really quickly, I wanted to highlight access. Barriers to access are tangible and intangible. So tangible barriers to access are things like bridges being out, roads being flooded. But intangible barriers to access are things like extreme heat events and smoke inundation, where it's literally unsafe to be out there in those conditions. So this chart is basically just a comparison of the air pollution inside and outside, and then a modeled projection of what the computer thinks that those should look like. And so we can actually see in some places it is cleaner outside air than inside. And so knowing that some of our houses are extremely porous, the recommendations to stay inside during those conditions, the shelter in place, are rather untenable to tribal members who are very adamant about subsistence harvesting and cultural harvesting. Like the foods are out there, they're calling, and so air quality be damned. And so making sure that those opportunities to continue treaty rights, even in circumstances where the weather is inclement, is going to be really important. We might scrolling down. So again, prescribed it's going to be a large component of our adaptation. We might scrolling down. Then we're going to have Kathleen Ackley. I'm hoping you're online and on deck because we'll give you 5 minutes. And so for first foods access, it's going to be really quick. Anticipate impacts to tribal harvesters. Those are things like extreme heat. Those are things like insect vector disease, and then smoke inundation. And so making sure that people who want to go out on the land, we probably are not going to be able to stop people from going out onto the land to exercise treaty rights. I would argue we should not stop people from doing that. We're making the decision and are protected as much as possible when going out and doing that. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling down. And so we see things like extreme heat, harmful algal blooms, and insect vectors as things that are already affecting our tribal harvesters. And so these things are going to continue and expand with climate change. And so making sure that we are understanding the risks, understanding what signs and symptoms to look for, and mitigating for that risk as much as possible are our 3 adaptation strategies there. Going. And then the last part of this is engage in policy and land management decisions. So again, we're already really doing this to a certain extent. There's always the opportunity to build capacity to do more. Capacity is the limiting factor for all of this. Our community is so knowledgeable and so enthusiastic about getting ahead of these changes and making a better future, but capacity is really where we're limited. And so continuing to advocate for funding, for cooperative agreements, for things that allow tribes and tribal members to be doing this work and to be the leaders in this work are really what we see as being beneficial in the long run. So, what mine's going? I think that's all I got. And so, wanted to conduct another poll. Thank you very much. We're going to do questions here in a second, but I'm going to conduct one more poll because I want to know what people are thinking with what you've heard today. So I'm closing the other poll. Thank you very much for all of your roles in our various operations. So this poll that's coming up here in your chat is around the impacts that were just shared with you. There we go. So the questions that we have are, what climate impacts are you most concerned about for first foods? So I'm going to also in the room for the folks that were listening. I would love to know your thoughts. Who is concerned about surface temperature warming? Yeah, I'm worried about our fish. How about plant habitat suitability migration? This is something that's a concern. Yeah. Impacts to pollinators, knowing that, you know, one of our major first foods pollinators is going to lose 30% habitat. Increased invasive species pressure. I think a lot of people are really concerned about that. The riparian erosion, topsoil erosion. Yes, very much so. And it's okay if we say yes to all of these. This is good data too. This goes into a grant. This goes into a grant proposal, you guys. Disconnect between vegetation growth and big game needs, and then changes in pathogens. Excellent. Yep, we're all concerned about all of it. It all really feeds together. And so it's really hard to pick one and prioritize one. And so that's kind of our aim, is that we're trying to get something that's going to work for all of these different impacts. Okay, I'm going to leave the poll open for people online. But I would love to open the floor for anybody that has questions or wants to say anything right now. And then I'm going to ask if Kathleen Ackley, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and letting us know that you're here.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, perfect. And so I wanted to stay first or questions first. We'll give it a minute or so. Welcome to unmute yourself or use that raise hand button to let us know that you want to talk, and that applies here in the room. Stuart, what do you got?
Yeah, I'm curious how quickly do plant species migrate? I'm talking about, 60 years, the habitat or climate being different, but how fast can the species move in there?
Yeah, that's why facilitated migration is a really important conversation. So I'm going to defer some plant questions to Cheryl, who is our expert. But I think that that's why it's really important to have that community conversation, is so we have that justification to say, these are the species that people think are important. This is where they're already being impacted. And knowing, again, those migration, the projections of where suitable habitat will be in the future, making sure that we're coordinating with those partners and intentionally planting out some of those. I do think that that's going to be necessary. I know it's not everybody's favorite opinion, but like you said, plants don't have legs. They can't get up and just walk across the highway. So we got to help them out somehow. Do you have anything to add to that, Cheryl?
Kind of a timeline. I think there's barriers to migration. From ridgetop to ridgetop, you're going to have that valley. That's a barrier. Suitable conditions, even if they are able to somehow migrate into there. So it depends on the species. Perennials are Along with its, they just don't spread as fast.
I think some of the soil microorganisms that these plants depend on or take advantage of won't be there.
Any other questions? Okay, please save it for discussion. So Kathleen, you have an opportunity for you to share a little bit about the Wallowa gathering. Are you prepared?
Does that mean it's my time to shine?
It is your time to shine. Please shine.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Ackley. I am the Executive Director of Wallowa Land Trust. We are a nonprofit conservation organization based in Enterprise, Oregon, and we service Wallowa County. And I was invited to speak to you briefly about this annual gathering program that we've been hosting. It's coming up in May. This will be our 4th year hosting tribal members from throughout the Northwest to come back to the homelands in Wallowa County and gather first foods and medicines on privately owned lands. So our land trust focuses our efforts on voluntary land conservation with private lands. And one of the core tenets or part of our mission is directly to work with Indigenous people to conserve land. And so this effort started 4 years ago when we visited the Umatilla, we visited Nespelem, and we also visited Lapwai to hear from tribal members their thoughts on conservation in Wallowa County. And one thing that we heard in common in those all 3 areas was decreasing concern over decreasing access to usual and custom or treaty reserved rights areas to gather first foods, particularly on privately owned lands. And so for us, being based here locally, we do have relationships with a lot of different landowners. And so it kind of got the little hamster in the head running quickly to think, well, we know some landowners that probably would be interested in providing access. And it just kind of started from there. The first year we had 17 gatherers come out and we hosted them over several days and visited a couple different privately owned properties. And now in the 4th year, it's going to be launched with a first foods root feast on May 21st at the Wallowa Longhouse. And women from Nez Perce tribe will be doing the cooking while Armin Minthorn has agreed to lead the services. And then after that, it's followed by 2 days, consecutive days of gathering on specifically privately owned lands here in Wallowa County. And our land trust has raised significant funds to be able to provide support, trying to reduce barriers for tribal members to be able to come out. So, you know, making sure everybody's fed, providing lodging, mileage reimbursement, and also we have been continuing to do a lot of outreach to find new landowners who would be of interest for tribal members to go out on their property. So right now we have at least probably 20 different private landowners who are interested in providing access for well over 40,000 acres here in Wallowa County. Now, not every property obviously is going to be appropriate for gathering. So one of the things that we're doing with all this outreach is we find who's interested, and part of it is a lot of it's education. But then there will be a small group of gatherers who will go out and visit different properties just to see, well, what's out there? Are there routes? Would it be appropriate? Can elders access the site? And then we will determine based on that preliminary information which properties will be targeted for the May 22nd, 23rd gathering. So yeah, it's a collaborative effort we're working with Wenix Red Elk, Dion Bronson and Nina Watchman. They're at Umatilla. So they're the point folks at Umatilla who are doing outreach to make sure members in the community know what's going on and can sign up. Carla Timantois is serving as a liaison for the community over in Lapwai and Kamiah in Idaho. And then Leslie Moses is doing outreach up in Nespelem, up in Colville. And so I am just really excited about the enthusiasm of gatherers to come back to Wallowa County and be together for a handful of days and gathering. And the role that we serve is facilitation, hosting. So really, we just want to make it possible, make it happen. We don't want to interfere, or we're not planning on going out and gathering with gatherers. It's more of trying to create the opportunity to make it happen and create situations where gatherers can meet landowners and develop relationships so that in the future, those properties can remain open to tribal members.
That's wonderful. And that's exactly what we were talking about today, is that idea of like building partnerships with the understanding that species will migrate. So thank you for doing that. I see that we did have a question in the chat, and so I'm happy to get to that question. And then after that, we're going to have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:05. Yep, go for it.
I add one more thing. I was really thinking about this as you were talking. You know, gatherers want to go to places where they can get big roots. Like if we're thinking about Couch, that's the main route that they'll be gathering in May. Is that, you know, you don't want to spend a bunch of time digging up little roots. You want to go to a place where there's large, robust roots. However, part of the problem I've seen is that a lot of these privately owned lands have not had gatherers out on them for a long time. So while they do have the roots, they're small. And so people are reluctant, like, oh, I don't know if I want to go gather there because it's going to take me twice as long and I can't, you know, get the same quality of roots. But unless they're out being gathered, they're not going to get any bigger. So it's a bit of a, what do you call
That's
it?
22.
Yes, there you go. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Perfect. Thank you. And then you had one question in the chat. Has the Wallowa Land Trust tried tapping into the connections that Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, OWEB, has with land funding from them? Are you talking to OWEB? Oh, you're muted.
We have not talked to OWEB. Most recently, the way we've done outreach is a lot of it has been Linda Sampson helping us because she knows every square inch. So we've gotten on Zoom and put up aerial views of Wallowa County. And then she has been right there, I want there, and she has pinpointed the areas that she thought were best for access. And then we went through to a GIS layer. We found out who owned all those properties that were privately owned. And then we sent letters to them. We've been calling them. We've been trying to get in touch with those people. And that's how we've gotten a lot of these new landowners. So it is targeted mainly properties around Tick Hill in Wallowa, properties out in the Zumwalt Prairie, and then properties adjacent to, is it along Rail Canyon up Armin Road up to Big Sheep Creek. So there are some core areas that we have focused outreach on based on what gatherers have told me of areas that are of interest to them.
That's wonderful. Yeah, if you're looking to expand in the future, there are landowners who receive funding from that Watershed Enhancement Board who might be good people to check in for the future of it. And then you had Dara says, it sounds like a great outreach program. Thank you for explaining it. I have been curious. So I think we're going to take a quick break, mostly just to turn over our speakers, and we're excited to have Cheryl, please.
I just have one quick question. Is there an opportunity, is there other days going to be available for gathering?
I think this is for you, Kathleen.
Yes, so what we have, the days, we have a limited amount of funding. So we're trying to support as many folks as possible that can come within that defined time period. And if we are, have funding left over, we can absolutely support folks coming out independently. Otherwise, you can come out at any time. And, you know, you can outreach to us, or we can put you in touch with landowners. I mean, there are lots of opportunities to come out. It's not limited to these handful of days, but the funding is limited to those handful of days.
Thank you. And we're going to have Lennox talk as part of the April 26th event too. So we'll have an opportunity to get back to it again. Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate it. And so we're just going to